Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here today. Thank you for joining us for session one of the annual conference of the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management for 2021. And we are, of course, here virtually today rather than face-to-face, but isn't it fantastic that we have been able to get together? My name's Alex. I'm the Vice Chair for External Affairs, and I'm only going to talk for a very brief period before I hand you over to some far more interesting people. A couple of little bits of housekeeping. Now, we have formatted the conference as an open meeting, so you'll all be able to see each other and interact with each other rather than that classic webinar style of only seeing one person. So we hope that works well, but just if we could be mindful of things like microphones being off when presenters are speaking, that would be much appreciated. Secondly, as you may have noticed, we are recording the session and we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel after the event, which means those members and other interested parties who weren't able to make the event can watch back. So if you would rather your face was not seen on YouTube, then please just be conscious of that when you're sharing your video. You'll see the timetable for today in front of you. There's an array of exciting and interesting talks today, really interesting mix for you. And I should mention that at the end of the session, there will be a networking opportunity and everyone's welcome to stay on with us and have a conversation and meet one another. You're welcome to have a glass of wine in hand. Unfortunately, we can't provide any for you because as you know, we are here virtually rather than face-to-face, but next year we'll be back to normal. The conference does continue tomorrow. For those who are interested in joining us tomorrow, there is a separate Zoom link. So there was a Zoom link for today and there's a different link for tomorrow, which should be in your emails. So if you are joining us tomorrow, do please remember to join us via that separate link. And we will have a short break in the middle of the session at about 5:15, where we've also got an opportunity for question and answer of any of our previous speakers, but hopefully there's sufficient time within the schedule for Q&A as we go along. Fantastic. That's all the housekeeping done. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor David Alexander for some opening remarks. Thank you, David.
Yes, thank you very much and welcome everyone. It's great to have you with us and it's very nice that you are able to log in and join us at this time. Well, we all know that we face unprecedented challenges in the present day. I've been studying disasters for 41 years, and it's rather felt over the last 18 or 19 months as if I've seen my entire career flash past my face at accelerated speed. There are so many possible lessons that we can derive from COVID. It's extraordinary, and not merely lessons for any future epidemic or the continuation of the present pandemic, but for many other kinds of event as well. One thing I've been thinking is, as I turn on the television every evening and I seem to see every night film of a different disaster. The summer was particularly illustrative of this, where it seemed as if we, in Southern Europe at least, we had wildfires, tornadoes, concentrated storms, flash floods, river floods and so on, night after night after night. And I rather think that we're going to need civil protection systems that are an order of magnitude more powerful and effective than the ones that we now have. That is actually for several reasons. Well, we've got worsening climate extremes, longer, more powerful, more frequent storms, floods, droughts, tornadoes, cold snaps, heat waves, wildfires, storm surges, or possibly even some combination of the above. But we've also got to contend with the possible consequences of technological failure. We have an increasing dependency on electricity. It's not only that all mass communication now depends on electricity, but think of how many things do depend on it, including banking in its entirety now. The cold chain of food supply, for example, pumping, water, sewerage, and fuel depends upon it. So the failure of electricity is unfortunately to some extent inevitable, despite all of the efforts to ensure that it doesn't happen. And so we need to consider what are the consequences of that, and they will cascade through a whole series of different issues and questions and sectors and so on. Then we have human mobility and unplanned mass migration. That also is something that needs to be coped with. I had the feeling around about 2015 that as far as this was concerned, worldwide, the cat was out of the bag, and that we were going to deal with more and more mobility over time, both legitimate mobility and that which at least certain forces and countries frown upon. But it will still have to be managed. And then there are the emerging and unusual risks. I honestly don't believe in black swans. I think there is little or nothing that we cannot foresee in some form. But that, of course, doesn't stop risks from being unusual and unprecedented, at least in certain periods of time or in certain dimensions. We might be facing in the future an influenza pandemic. We might be facing the impact of a space weather storm of the caliber of the Carrington event of 1859, for example, which might burn out transformers and knock out satellites and all sorts of things. And of course, rather than facing the direct consequences, we're more likely to be facing the indirect consequences on things like the distribution of goods, on transportation, on movement, on the supply of electricity and the consequences of losing it. So in all of this, the background of emergency response is changing as well. We're into an age which is increasingly dominated by what goes on online. You could say that of this conference even, which is perhaps one of the positive sides of it rather than the negative sides, which we debate so much. But we are into the age of identity politics and polarization. We're into an age of loss of trust in authority, which could lead to a form of anarchy, anomie, as Emile Durkheim described it in his 19th century book on labor. And hopefully not too much. Hopefully we can get around these problems, but they are nevertheless a background to vulnerability to other things such as storms and floods and the rest of it. We have a loss of trust because of a widespread failure to lead by example in the pandemic. And that is something we might consider. And increasingly, we have inequality in society, which leads to dissatisfaction and unrest. I rather think that we have to look at specific vulnerability to hazards and so on in the light of general vulnerability to life as it is lived. COVID, it seems, has rather coarsened the debate, and we need to get back to a little more gentlemanly and ladylike discourse about these things so that we can rationally examine what we can do about things. And I'm sure there will be very much of that during these two sessions of this excellent conference. But if you look at the way disasters, emergencies, crises, and so on are being confronted at present, there is, I fear, a terrible tendency to look backwards and plan for the last disaster rather than the next one. Now, what I don't mean is that we should avoid the lessons of history. And in fact, the lessons of history, as we know, are absolutely vital. And this conference will contribute some fascinating and important information that we can meditate on regarding the lessons of particular events from the recent past. However, there is an increasingly pressing need to exercise foresight, whatever that means, because the crises of the future may well be rather different to those of the past. Now, in this, we're talking about perhaps disaster science, which is something that we're trying to promote. The ability to manage events and to plan for them and to respond to them in a way that is at least adequate and hopefully excellent. If we look at the United Kingdom, it's a country that lacks an adequate civil protection system. It's got the expertise and some of the best in the world even. It's got the fragments of the system, but what it has not got is the joined up system. I think it therefore is important that we try to promote disaster science, get it more of a seat at the table. There are no disaster scientists on the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, for example. I do believe there ought to be. And disaster science is often ignored, underfunded, or sidelined in ways that really don't help, because if you look at something like COVID, you find that about half of it is actually a civil protection and emergency management problem rather than a medical problem. It's a logistical problem, it's a communications problem, and I think we have an enormous amount to contribute on these particular topics, and hopefully we can do so if we get our act together, we work together, we collaborate, we foster this discipline of disaster science, and we endeavour to get it a seat at the table. So I know that you're all passionate about this field, whatever we call it, emergency preparedness, disaster risk reduction, whatever. And I wish you the very best in this vital endeavour of getting it a better profile and more recognition so that it can give its full and legitimate contribution to society, which really needs this field more than ever before. Good luck with the rest of the conference. It's an excellent event, a fine initiative, and many thanks to the organisers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for those words to open our conference this year. Okay, so next up on our first speaker on the agenda, we have Maddie Weir from the UK Health Security Agency, who's come to talk to us about the UN, DRR and ISC hazard information profiles. Maddie, are you there?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, David. Yes, I am here. Could you just confirm that you can see my screen, please?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Hold on. Yes, we can see it now.
Apologies, Zoom is not my medium of choice normally, so you may have to bear with me with some of these technological issues. So hello, everybody. My name is Maddie Weir. I'm the technical officer within the Global Disaster Risk Reduction team at the newly formed UK Health Security Agency. My presentation this afternoon is focusing around the UNDRR and ISC Hazard Information Profile Supplement. And this supplement is very recently published. It came out at the beginning of this month. What it hopes to do is contribute a new lexicon for when we talk about disaster risk. It hopes to provide definitions and hazards that we can use as practitioners, but also researchers around the world, so that we can use a common language. My presentation today is not going to be linear. I want to give you an initial overview of the political context and the policy context that made this work not only possible, but very needed. And then I want to show you very aspirationally where we hope that this project might take us, the different projects that it may contribute to, and the different understandings that it may help us get to. The final part of this presentation, I really hope is going to be interactive, and I invite you all to contribute. I want to really get a sense of how these hazard profiles might be relevant to your research and might be relevant to your work as practitioners. So when we start this story, I think the best place to start is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which many of you may be very familiar with. The Sendai framework hopes to really substantially reduce the impact of disaster risk on individuals, on their lives, their livelihoods and their health, but also structures and institutions and networks around the world. The UK Health Security Agency takes a very strong interest in the Sendai framework because health resilience is strongly promoted throughout. The Sendai framework is one of the 3 UN landmark agreements that came out in 2015. And you can see that the Sendai framework in this little fantastic graphic that we have here is the latest in a long line of different frameworks, all aimed at improving our understanding of disaster risk and also taking the best available policy advice and scientific advice and turning it into something that's actionable in the international system, but also at national, regional and local levels as well. The Sendai framework, as I said, is one of those 3 international agreements that came out in 2015, alongside the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure is on everybody's mind in the lead up to COP next month, and also the Sustainable Development Goals, and it intersects very strongly with the international health regulations as well, given that it has a health resilience focus throughout. The Sendai framework, in a nutshell, if you haven't heard of it or if you aren't so familiar with it in your work, the Sendai framework really aims to do 7 things. It aims to achieve 7 global targets. It aims to reduce mortality, people affected by disasters, economic loss, so the actual dollar sign that we might put on a disaster when we're responding to it or trying to mitigate it, and also damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. Quite symmetrically, it also aims to increase 3 things: countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, international cooperation for developing countries who may need the assistance, and the availability and access of multi-hazard and early warning systems as well, which is all, I think, very useful as context for the Sendai framework, but it also is the picture on paper, but we know that in real life it becomes marginally more complicated. This graphic is really helpful because it shows the interlinkage between the Sendai framework and some of the other global agreements that are floating around, like the Sustainable Development Goals. If you're reporting against any number of the 7 targets for the Sendai framework, it maps across relatively well to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. There is that degree of interoperability between the data that we submit. At this stage, I think it might be useful to actually look at the targets of the Sendai framework in a little bit more detail. So, for example, target A, which is the number of deaths and missing persons attributed by disaster per 100,000 person, initially looks like a really good statistic for understanding the impact of disaster at that very high level. But if we put it into context, say, within the COVID-19 pandemic in the United Kingdom, it becomes a lot more complex, because how do we actually count deaths from COVID? What counts as persons affected by COVID? Is it the people who have died in hospitals, as is one statistic? Or is it the people who have died outside of hospitals as well, in care homes and nursing homes? Does somebody need to have a positive test before they die of COVID in order for it to be counted as a COVID death? Or do they simply need to have positive symptoms? And this becomes really complicated, not only within the United Kingdom, but when we begin to compare internationally as well. So how can we compare between countries who may be using different systems of measurement for what is effectively the same global target? So we can see that while this is a really good starting point, the Sendai framework and their 7 global targets, the picture becomes so much more complicated as we begin to put it into practice. And so the contribution that my team hopes to make with this hazard information profile supplement is that we want to use that to begin to unpick some of this complexity, to begin to provide better definitions that we might use as practitioners within disaster risk reduction. So the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction has 4 priorities. And the first one, I think, is the most relevant to this presentation, which is actually understanding disaster risk. Just with that one global target, we can see that it becomes really complicated to actually put any of that into practice. But if we can't measure, then we can't manage. So if we don't actually understand what it is we're measuring within disaster risk, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more difficult to implement the other priorities of the Sendai framework. For example, the governance structures we may need to respond to disasters, the amount of money and resources we may need to allocate to invest in disaster risk reduction for resilience, or even the kind of materials and expertise that we may need for effective response and to build back better as well. Last year, we published the UNDRR ISC Sendai Hazard Definition and Classification Review Technical Report. This was led by our colleagues at UNDRR, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the International Science Council, the ISC. And what this publication did at a very basic level is that it called for a data revolution. It acknowledged that the materials that we were collecting, the data that we were collecting, wasn't quite sufficient enough for us to get that really full picture of the complexity, so that we could begin to make those recommendations around response and investing in disasters. And what it called for, in addition to clearer data, it wanted really rigorous accountability around those definitions that we were providing, and really the accountability around how we were going to begin to measure that. And to do that, we needed to not only renew our global partnerships, but invest in them to bring them together to create that accountability. And what came out of that document was a list of 302 hazards. And that 302 hazards was drawn from different glossaries around the world, which I think Professor Alexander also helped to contribute in the initial phases of this project. But the 302 hazards were really difficult to come to an agreement around. I think the initial list was something around 900 or to 1,000 different hazards that were proposed by different UN agencies. And so we whittled it down to these 302 spread across 8 different broad categories. So biological hazards, as we've seen with COVID, is very, very relevant. Hydrometeorological hazards like flooding, technological hazards like supply chain failure or dam failure, geohazards like earthquakes, which are your traditional, I suppose, disasters that you may think of, chemical hazards, environmental hazards, extraterrestrial hazards, and societal hazards, which, while they were not initially included in the Sendai framework, we thought societal hazards were a really timely addition, because societal hazards are things like civil unrest and violence and explosive remnants of war, all the things which have never actually had a formal UN definition around because they were deemed too political or too complex. And so this is a novel contribution in that simply we have been able to define the societal hazards in an agreed way with our UN member partners. This is what our hazard information profiles look like. So as I've said before, the initial report called for a data revolution, and this is our first step towards that data revolution, where we take our hazard profiles and we want to write not only a primary definition, but also other information as well. Our primary definition was sourced from the highest possible authority that we could find. So for many of our hazard profiles, that was our UN partners, but it was also scientific partners where we could make composite definitions of widely used scientific definitions as well, where the UN definition was not possible. The scientific definition sits underneath, which gives an expanded definition with examples and many other elements that may be relevant but couldn't be put into the primary definition. We've also included globally agreed metrics, limits and guidelines, UN conventions, and also essential annotations around drivers of the risk and also potential cascading hazards as well. And finally, we also have the ownership of the definition. So this is that step towards the accountability that I was talking about earlier. And this is really the final product. So this is an example of some of the hazards that we have. We can see that there are 8 on screen at the moment, all with the beautiful Sendai colors along the top. But these are examples of the different hazards that may be contained within the report. So for example, financial shock, Zika virus, or heat waves. And we recognize that while this is an initial step towards a data revolution, towards better definitions that we can monitor and measure, by no means is it a job finished. And so this is very much the process that we followed initially, where we identified the expert authors from the various different hazards. So for example, we had fantastic engagement around our hydrometeorological hazards from our working groups within the World Meteorological Organization. And then once the hazard information profile was written, we had it peer reviewed externally by people who were not involved in the actual writing of the document. And this is a very iterative process. It took a very long time to strike the right balance between information that would be relevant to practitioners, but also information that was relevant and readable for people who weren't experts. So for policymakers or ministers who might need to be briefed about heat waves or might need to know a bit more about violence, for example. After this very iterative process, the HIP was taken to the chair of the technical working group, my colleague Virginia Murray, and the HIP was agreed and put into the supplement. The aim is very much that while this is now published, that we will go back to it in 3 years' time and that we will take on various feedback that we get from forums like this, but also feedback from practitioners around the world, and we will update these hazard profiles and potentially also add new ones if they need to. I think at this stage, it's useful to acknowledge that 302 hazards means a lot of authors and a lot of peer reviewers. This has been a fantastic global partnership of over 150 different partners who have contributed to this work in some way. So that includes the UN agencies, so the WHO, World Health Organization, the World Meteorological Organization, and others, but also scientific partners from around the world, including CODATA and GEM and other geohazard organizations. We've been really, really fortunate to have international humanitarian organizations collaborating with us as well, particularly the International Federation of the Red Cross, which really lends a different perspective on some of these hazards, because it means that these are going to be used by these organizations when they're responding to disasters. It takes it out of the realm of the theoretical and really puts it quite firmly into the practical. Finally, we also were very fortunate to have our partners from industry as well. So earlier I talked about how it's really difficult to put a dollar sign on a disaster. And we were very fortunate in our technical working group to have colleagues from the Insurance Development Forum join us, who were able to provide some of that input around what are the challenges that we may have when we actually are trying to articulate some of these challenges when it comes to monitoring, which is very helpful. So I've shown you the road so far. It's been a very long, very iterative process to produce these hazard information profiles, and they've been very well received in the months since they've been out. But now I need to show you what's going to come next. What are our aspirations? What are the projects that we're already involved in? And what are the impacts that these hazard information profiles, what might they have? So one of the common themes of this talk has been the fact that it's really difficult to monitor and to evaluate. When you have complex and cascading disasters, all of a sudden it becomes really difficult to unpick that complexity and to produce statistical definitions that will be fit for purpose. So we're doing some work with the UN Economic Commission for Europe, where we're taking a couple of these hazards, really quite a pick and mix approach, and creating statistical definitions for them that can be tested by their offices for national statistics, that can be tested by those practitioners who work in those countries, who work with the disasters, to see if they're fit for purpose. The idea is that these definitions will be very highly scalable, that they need to be relevant at all levels in order to be usable and in order to be useful. We're also working very closely with our colleagues at the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the World Meteorological Organization, as they've created a Centre of Excellence, which will aim to ratify relevant hazard information profiles, which means these will be the rubber-stamped gold standard definitions to be used in the international system and will be used exclusively by those organizations. So we have a lot of hopes for what these will do, and we have heard from various corners of the world that these are getting translated into Farsi, into Welsh, into Indigenous languages elsewhere as well. And we really are excited to see what comes next. But taking a moment, we've seen what comes before, we've seen where we're going, and now I'd like to ground us in the present. And I'd like to do a bit of a scenario-based exercise with you to try and get the brain juices working, and also just to try and get a little bit of feedback around how these might be useful to you guys as practitioners or as researchers or in various different elements of your work. And so the scenario is that Hazardlandia, our lovely made-up country, has just experienced a devastating coastal flood. And if I might ask everybody to please go to menti.com on their phone or their laptop and input the code just there, we can begin to discuss some of the hazard profiles in a bit more detail and also answer some of the other questions that I've posed in this session. Hoping that everybody can still see the code.
No, it's disappeared off my screen.
Has it disappeared? Let me see if I can put it into the chat then. 1 second, everyone. So it's 7782-6277. Apologies, there we go. That should be the first question for everybody. Apologies. So what are the cascading events that, cascading hazards that Hazardlandia might experience after a coastal flood? Building collapse and public health issues, absolutely. Epidemic, theft, cholera outbreak, fantastic. Landslide, disease dissemination, public health outbreaks, absolutely. So I'm just going to share my screen and the hazard information profiles here, so I can still see all your answers coming in on the Mentimeter. So this is our hazard profile for the estuarine or coastal flood. And as you can see, we have the definition up here, which is owned by the WMO. And you can see that there are actually no metrics and numeric limits. So one of the advantages of this hazard information profile is that actually it also identifies the gaps that we may have in our understandings around these various hazards. It is useful to have this high degree of specificity because it means that we can actually begin to understand globally where those gaps are. So I can see infrastructure failure, supply chain disruption. Apologies, this is being a little bit slow today for some reason. So one of the advantages of this document, although I think it's my UK HSA technology letting me down rather than the document itself, is that all of the hazard information profiles are actually hyperlinked here. And so we are able to look and say, for example, building collapse, and it'll take you directly to the 2 or 3 pages of the hazard profile. So it means it's very easily accessible and also easily shareable. So the building collapse, for example, was a really difficult one to begin to unpick, and it is owned, unfortunately, by no single agency. So this is one of the hazards where we had to go back to our scientific partners and also our industry partners, both in New Zealand and more widely around the world, where they're able to provide specific input around what a building collapse might look like as a proper scientific definition, because one didn't exist. As for supply chain failure, it may be interesting for those of you who work around logistics to know that there was no actual definition for supply chain failure either, which began to be both politically interesting because, of course, how do you define what supply chain failure looks like? Should we perhaps be instead talking about supply chain disruption? And so it meant that the definition that we came to was very, very high level and very broad. And so this is an example of where we wanted it to be relevant to every country and to every single context, but that we can also add that additional specificity in some of our additional scientific description. And we also made it very relevant to our high level stakeholders as well. So here we have, interestingly, poverty is highlighted as one of them. And this is one of the hazards that was highlighted and was not included actually, but we thought it perhaps could be a driver of hazards in the same way that climate change was not included as a hazard, but rather a driver of hazards, something that exacerbates existing ones. But if we were going to do a review, perhaps this is something that we could also pick up again. So moving to the next question, which is how might the hazard information profiles, given that you've had a very brief introduction to them and the context around why they were created in the first place, how might these hazard information profiles be relevant to your research and to your teaching and your other work? So one colleague has said, I use these in lectures, talks, and meetings, which is fantastic. Of course, if you are using these in your lectures and talks, we'd love to hear about it. One of the things that we're doing at the moment is mapping all the different places these have been disseminated already. It'll unite stakeholders around acceptable terminology. That's absolutely what we're hoping will happen. We want this to be a new lexicon for talking about disaster risk in a really common way. To briefly acquaint students who are not familiar with this field, absolutely. I know certainly in our workplace already, this is really useful for briefing colleagues who don't really have an understanding of all hazards, but are only looking at public health hazards. This helps to put those public health hazards in the wider landscape of vulnerability and risk. Technological and epidemiological, absolutely. Helps to define the terminology and reduce confusion around data collection. That is absolutely the hope for us. I like this word evolving lexicon. And it will do in leaps and bounds as we continue to develop it in years to come with our partners, and international consistency around the language that we use between global agencies. This is something that we've struggled with for a long time. Somebody's hurricane might be somebody else's cyclone, for example. So having these common definitions, which we really have sourced from such a wide variety of stakeholders, should really hope to bring those different groups together to have a common language. We're currently working on Horizon Europe disaster-related proposals. So one use will be for ensuring we have standard terminology and metrics in that proposal. Absolutely. This is something that we've been doing in our team already. When we've been submitting proposals or co-submitting proposals, we make sure that our terminology is aligned as well. That supports discussions around risk in both lectures and also in work and different consultancies. So thank you so much for all of your really rich contributions to the Menti. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I hope that if
I think we've lost you, Maddie. This, of course. Are you back?
Yes.
You just dropped out at the end there, but I think we've got you back now.
Sorry, I was about to say, if there are any questions, please do let me know at this time. Thank you so much for your patience with my technological ineptitude. But thank you so much for being a fabulous audience and for contributing so richly to the Menti.
Thank you, Maddie. Really, really interesting and an excellent talk to open with. We have just over 5 minutes for questions. If any colleagues have any questions, do feel free to raise your hand and hop on the microphone and ask Maddie a question, or indeed make a comment or expand on some of your inputs. Okay, I don't see any hands. I perhaps have a question for for you and for everyone. I think it's very interesting that there was a proactive decision not to include climate change as a hazard, but as a catalyzing driver of hazards, which of course I think is accurate. But do you think that that approach helps us gain traction in synergy between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation? Because of course this is the big issue that I think those of us that research climate change as it affects and impacts disasters face, in that climate change adaptation and approaches are often seen and addressed in one sphere, whereas disaster risk reduction is often seen and addressed in another. And I just wonder if there are any thoughts from yourself or others in terms of how we might close that gap between the two.
Nice, easy question to start off with. Thank you, Alex.
Sorry.
Absolutely. I'd invite my other colleagues to join in as we answer this question. But I think having this common terminology or this kind of evolving lexicon, which is going to be my new go-to term when describing this, is a great initial first step towards actually better understanding disaster risk and beginning to unpick some of those complexities. So there's still so much that we don't know about disaster risk. There's still so much that we're learning about climate change adaptation that I hope this is a first step in having a common language that can be used across both. And of course, this is a contribution to the Sendai framework, which intersects with other international agreements which address climate change. So I hope that this will also be used kind of across that, across those organizations that deal with both. I hope that answers your question a little bit, but I think we're also going to see more and more as time goes on how this may be used.
Thank you, Maddie. We also have a question from Tim.
Hello. I don't know if hopefully you can see. Well, hopefully you can see me and hear me.
We can hear you.
I don't have a face for radio rather than TV. Right. First of all, thank you ever so much for the presentation. Very informative. And hello, Virginia. I know that Virginia's been working on this for many years in the old HBA days. Really, the question is, do you as a team support the government around the National Risk Register? Because this is such a rich background of information. I think it would support that. And certainly my local resilience forum gets really hung up about risks, but it's also about the capability to mitigate the risk, or at least manage the response to it. And I think, the information you provided is really welcomed. And I think it's how do you get that information now to a wider UK audience around local resilience forums? And then also how we can get that driven down through the public health route. So as a practitioner, you talk about, health resilience, but actually our world is hardly mentioned, yet we're going through the biggest health emergency for a generation, if not more. So it's about how do we bring all that together? I'm sorry, it's a long, complicated question, but cracking job. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a fantastic question, and it's something that we can begin to answer, but as with this, unfortunately, we're going to see it develop in the future as well. At the moment, we feed into a number of different functions in government around both planning for future risks. So there's some work that we're undertaking with the Department for Food and Rural Affairs around future risks and planning for them within the National Risk Register. So we've been providing input around our new terminology there. We've also circulated this work cross-government to the Cabinet Office with our colleagues who do report on the Sendai framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're doing a piece of work at the moment where we are scoping how we do get this embedded more fully into the National Risk Register, both in the UK, but also I think more widely as well, because this can be useful across the world. The piece of work I mentioned with the UN Economic Commission for Europe, where we want to develop those statistical definitions, those are really going to be relevant to international risk registers as well, or international national risk registers rather as well. But that being said, what I wanted to get from this session when I agreed to speak was not only to let you guys know about the hazard information profiles and all their complexity and all their usefulness, but also to get exactly that kind of question, because we want to know how we can feed this down to you and what the best forums would be to do that, and how we can make this something that is not only useful and usable, but that we can make it used as well. So I'd be really happy to take this conversation offline as well and begin to talk about in a bit more detail about how we can make this useful for you, if that would be suitable.
That's brilliant. Very happy to chat.
Great. I'll drop my email into the chat once the session is over.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Maddie. Probably time just for one more question if anyone had a burning question on the tip of their tongue.
Silence from the gallery.
Okay, thank you very much, Maddie. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for that talk. Okay, so I am delighted to hand over next to Pete Davis, who's going to talk to us twice today, and this is part one of Pete's talk. And this is, I think, Pete, more of a proposal around excellence in disaster research and the Institute's potential role in assisting with academic research. So hopefully, Pete, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can I just do a sound check? Is that working?
Yeah, absolutely. Hear you perfectly. I can see the screen as well.
Oh, you can see my screen. That's more than I can do at the moment. Hang on. Has that now got the full slide on there?
Yes, it has.
Okay, brilliant. Well, like you say, it is more of a proposal than anything else, and really an opportunity to canvass some views of friends and colleagues in the room. So, by way of introduction, I know a lot of people in the room already, but to those who I don't, good afternoon. It's great to be able to attend the ICPEM annual conference again this year. And thanks to the organisers for that opportunity to be able to present at the first session this afternoon. As you'll already have seen, I hope from the programme, both my contributions relate to what Pete Simpson some time ago in 2009 termed pracademia, so that balance of professional practice and the rigour of academia. That will become more apparent as we go on, but in terms of an introduction to myself, all those years ago I gained the MSc in Civil Emergency Management through the University of Hertfordshire, as I know many people online either did or were involved in. And since then, I've had a bit of a varied career through local authority emergency planning, a brief period in the NHS ambulance service, and then mostly in the fire and rescue service, where I've been for 17 years. But really, more relevant to my contributions this afternoon is that I'm currently navigating the journey through a part-time professional doctorate in emergency services management up at Edge Hill University in Lancashire. But more about the specifics of that really after the mid-session break. In terms of experience with ICPEM and its predecessors, I joined the Institute of Emergency Management, which of course was one of the predecessors of ICPEM, and served for 3 years as its honorary secretary up until 2007. And I was also a member of the Institute of Civil Defence and Disaster Studies, which was the other pre-merger predecessor organisation to ICPEM. So the presentation really is intended to float a developing idea, perhaps sow a seed and see what germinates, and canvass your thoughts to see if you think a proposal is worth progressing. And I want to really ground it in ICPEM's objectives and its mission. So if we have a look at the motto, which appears in the banner under the badge of ICPEM, it talks about excellence in disaster research and the overall mission to bring together emergency professionals, academics and business in order to provide an informed and influential voice on all aspects of civil protection and emergency management. And if we refer back to the original objectives of the Institute, included in those, amongst others, are two which I think are particularly relevant to the field of research. So it talks about promoting the highest standards of study and research into all aspects of emergencies and disasters, and to disseminate recognised research and information which could beneficially influence public and private emergency management practices. So overall, I think as I progress through this short presentation, just keep those objectives of the Institute in mind and think about how perhaps this might sit well within those objectives and contribute to the overall aims of the Institute. After a little over then 20 years in emergency management, I had that little voice in my ear, which was very quiet after my bachelor's degree and got a little bit louder after the MSc degree, and it talking about don't forget the PhD. And over the course of the last few years, that little voice has got louder and louder to a point where I could no longer really ignore it. And that coincided with the establishment of the part-time professional doctorate in emergency services management up at Edge Hill. And that, in the words of Professor Hennessy on the screen, kind of relit my intellectual curiosity. I had, I suppose, in his words, sputtered out, and I've now come back again to look at level 8 kind of PhD level study. And I'm now just entering my third year of a 4.5-year part-time program. So I'll talk more about that in the second half of the presentation a bit later on. But of course, I'm not the only one in the Institute who's currently treading this path. And recent editions of Communique, our internal newsletter, have profiled several members, and I take that to include all grades of membership, including fellows, who are also undertaking doctorates in subjects related to the strategic interests and objectives of the Institute. Again, there could well be many more members currently studying at either undergraduate or postgraduate level who haven't yet been featured in Communique, or who for their own reasons would prefer not to be included. In particular, when the conference programme was circulated earlier today, I also noted that Maddie is undertaking her part-time PhD, which is a notable omission from this slide. So apologies for that, but I'm sure that there are others who haven't been included but are currently juggling the tricky balance of research, study, work, and domestic life. And of course, we can add to that the large number of members who already hold their postgraduate qualifications but aren't currently engaged in academic studies, those in academia who are supervising current postgraduate researchers in fields of interest to the ICPEM, and others who've got a wealth of valuable experience, which can be of huge benefit to current and future research students, regardless of the stage of their individual career pathway. This slide really attempts to illustrate a very generic and simplified postgraduate research journey from application and entry to ultimately the conferment of the desired award, a process which we know could take several years and is extended still further if studying on a part-time basis. Those various assessment gateways which are mentioned towards the bottom of the slide will, of course, vary from institution to institution. But in general, the overall process will involve some elements which are common to all postgraduate research programs, including elements like the literature review, ethical scrutiny, matters of methodology and methods, study design, data collection, data analysis, discussions and conclusions. Each of those elements will have their own requirements, which all of us as postgraduate researchers will need to satisfy somewhere along our individual journeys. But I feel sure that we could all benefit from the advice, experience and the practical points from those who've already been through the process, or indeed are currently going through it. And I think that would also help to alleviate the commonly noted feelings of perhaps isolation, which doctoral students in particular seem to go through as they progress through their journey. So really, it's on that basis that I wonder whether there is some potential for the ICPEM in support of those mission and objectives which we looked at earlier, to connect researchers and students in the field of civil protection, emergency management and disaster studies. I think there's the potential to develop a supportive network of researchers who are either actively engaged in current postgraduate studies, have already completed their studies, and may be active in the world of academia, or perhaps who are thinking about taking the plunge and want to engage with others in a kind of a conducive environment, providing advice, support, and mutual benefit, mutual encouragement for the benefit of all concerned. And I've listed there some of those common areas of interest, which, regardless of the individual topic of study, each of those researchers will need to face, to grapple with, and to come to some conclusions about. In terms of how that might be done practically, really, I've got two potential suggestions. One way of practically mobilising that support within the membership could be to dedicate a part of the annual conference, perhaps in a parallel specialist stream, if not in the main plenary session, to provide an opportunity for current research students to explore their developing work to what I've kind of termed loosely as a first stage peer review, a first opportunity to expose their ongoing work to some critical friends in a supportive environment. It would provide that opportunity to discuss a number of issues, whether they are subjects which are equally relevant to all researchers or perhaps more specific to the individual's field of study, which could assist them in getting to grips with academically thorny issues, and goodness me, there are enough of them, or providing an opportunity to introduce a research project and throw it open to collective insights of the membership, which might generate different approaches, perhaps improvements on current thinking, or access to unknown or unexplored gold mines of literature and data. Perhaps another way of benefiting from the membership's collective experience could be through the establishment of a research special interest group that might provide more ongoing support rather than the single point in the calendar of the annual conference, as I've discussed previously. As you know, the Institute's already got 3 special interest groups, the Blue Light, Historical and International SIGs. So depending on the levels of interest and enthusiasm resulting from this presentation, it's possible that a research SIG could also provide similar benefits, but outside of those confines of the annual conference timetable. So I'll stop there. I suppose really it's generated out of practical experience of my journey so far, of speaking to other postgraduate research students, but not limiting it necessarily to postgraduates, and just feeling that there might be the opportunity for the ICPEM through its mission, vision and objectives to support those of us who are still going through study to get to grips with either those generic skills, the generic issues, or issues more related to our specific topic of research. So Alex, I'll leave it there, but interested to hear views of delegates here today and to perhaps see where we might go from here.
Thank you, Pete. Really interesting. And I can already see that there are some hands that have gone up. So I'll come to Maddie first, please.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Pete, for such an informative presentation. I think it really speaks to what a lot of us are going through as part-time researchers, because they are very unique challenges. I do wonder, this may not be a question you can answer, but putting it to the wider group as well, I think one of the values that ICPEM could provide is that it could be a forum for increased interdisciplinarity. So I know that for me, my research is grounded in medical anthropology, but my background is significantly more interdisciplinary. And this is something that, as a practitioner, everything needs to be interdisciplinary. So I was wondering, as an ethos and perhaps as a forum, this could be really useful for those who are undertaking research for the first time, encouraging those good practices. But I would welcome your thoughts.
Well, I mean, my feeling is that the ICPEM in its membership brings together a whole range of different people with different experiences and access to a whole range of different information. So I think you're right in terms of the interdisciplinary nature of its membership. It affords access, support, encouragement in that conducive atmosphere, that conducive environment. So there are a number of opportunities through the ICPEM and perhaps through something like this researchers forum where you can gain access to people or data that you would never otherwise get to. So I think that's an overall benefit myself.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maddie. Any other questions or comments? I will fill some space and give my own thoughts, Pete. From a executive council viewpoint, we've been working over the past 6 months or so, I would say, to look at how we expand our student program, including both those currently studying at undergraduate as well as those currently studying at postgraduate, but expanding that a little bit further to actually be a young members program more broadly and include people such as early career researchers and early career practitioners as well. So I think your proposal specifically around postgraduate research offerings and what we can do to closely knit those individuals together fits very well in terms of the wider space that we see ICPEM moving into and providing support to students more broadly, because I think my own personal view is that there is no single institution or society that knits together those undertaking studies or research within our field. There just isn't one that offers it, and I think ICPEM could fill that space, and that's why we've been working towards that goal. So really heartened to see that that's something that others agree with. I
suppose just on that point, I was just going to say I particularly like the fact that you use student was synonymous as young persons or young members program. So I'll take that. That's excellent.
You can consider yourself within it, Pete. Absolutely. David, I think your hand was first.
Yes, thank you very much. I really support this idea of having a special interest group on research. I think that's an excellent idea. Why didn't I think of that? Well, evidently you've got something I haven't there. ICPEM was founded as a learned society. We therefore support research by definition. I don't think we need to do a great deal of research, but we have members who do research, and we ought to be fostering that and supporting them. And I think that's a really great idea, which will have excellent benefits for all concerned. So please to go ahead if you are thinking of launching this initiative. And I think that's absolutely great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Mal.
Yeah, it's really just to echo what other people have said, really. I think Alex is right. You know, the young persons program is targeted at those who are studying at graduate level and are new to the profession. But you're quite right, Pete. There's lots of people within the Institute of varying ages who are still undertaking studies. And I think whilst I think as an institute, we do need to focus on younger membership, because actually they are the Institute's future. I think the SIG is a really good opportunity to pull together the I have to be careful with my words, the more mature students in sharing research and ideas. And I think it's really important. ICPEM as an institute was, for me, the academia side of life, although I'm like you, a practitioner, a pracademic, I find it really, really interesting. So I think the more sort of research ideas and papers that are published by the institute members would be really, really useful and really interesting. So yeah, that's a brilliant idea about the SIG.
Thanks, Mal. And then Rob, you've also got your hand up.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks, Pete. Good evening. Good afternoon. As a spring chicken of 50 years old and starting my my route down to the PhD world of academia, again, I'll just add support to it and add support to what Pete is recommended this evening. I think the only thing I could add from an ICPEM perspective is the Institute is a international institute, and I think it hopefully will attract some of our wider afield members, and the role of the international universities outside of the UK, and certainly from a research point of view, that may open up doors and be useful for ICPEM members and students alike. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Rob. I don't see any other hands, so back to you, Pete, perhaps for your closing thoughts, unless anyone else has any other questions or comments.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I'm heartened by the support from the delegates today, so thank you for that. I suppose it is born out of practical experience as we kind of traverse this journey of postgraduate research, because you do come up against some fairly academically thorny issues that you have to grapple with and resolve. And if you're not careful, you are doing it sitting at your desk all alone and feeling rather isolated and thinking, well, am I the only person that's going through this? Of course, the answer is no, you're not. But perhaps through the offices of the ICPEM, we might be able to generate that mutual support and really, I suppose, a sounding board of interested, encouraging, friendly people who are going through the same journey as you. And I think that can only be a good thing. So perhaps this really is worth progressing.
Superb. Thank you, Pete. And there's some more supportive comments that have come through in the chat there as well. Excellent. So we're slightly ahead of schedule, but we will stick to our schedule so colleagues who are planning to join us at a certain time can. So are there any, just before we go to a break, are there any other questions or comments, any questions for any of the previous speakers, for Pete or for Maddie, or indeed for David with his opening remarks, that anyone would like to take the opportunity to ask prior to moving to a short break?
Could I just say that I really miss the face-to-face side of ICPEM. Obviously, we're not going to take risks and we're not going to do things we can't or shouldn't. And no doubt we will get back to some form of face-to-face when we can. But there is definitely something there that, unfortunately, pandemic conditions cannot replicate adequately. Of course, that's a great shame for those who couldn't get down to London, because everything was in London, which is obviously unfair, but there and again, what were we to do? Nevertheless, I do hope that we'll have a situation where we can join in together. There's just something about, I don't know, the body language, the articulation, and the drinking beer or wine together, and so on, that helps improve the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think we can all agree with that. Okay, if there are no other thoughts or comments, then we will take a momentary pause and come back at 17:30, that's 5:30, UK time. I will pause the recording while we are all out. If anyone would like to use this space to have a chat, please feel free to. Otherwise, if we could try and get everyone back in the room, so to speak, just prior to past, then we'll be ready for our next speaker. Thank you very much and see you shortly. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've all managed to have a screen break and grab a tea or a coffee or your beverage of choice. I can see a couple of people who left are just starting to flow back in, so we'll just give them 1 moment to come back to the screen, and then we'll introduce our next speaker. Okay, it's 17:31, so let's make a start. So our next speaker for session 1 of the conference is Bruce Wong. Bruce, I'm hoping you're there. And Bruce is going to talk to us about a piece of research he's undertaken with regards to honorariums for emergency volunteers. I can see you, Bruce, so let me spotlight you. Hello. Hopefully you can share, and over to you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
I can see your screen. Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I will say good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bruce Wong from Hong Kong. It's my midnight, so I'm very happy to meet you all in here to share my the result of my small research. That is the Auditorium of the Emergency Volunteers. I think the topic is quite unique because normally we always talking about the volunteers need to do some unpaid job. They should be unpaid and they should enjoy their volunteer works and so on extra. It's actually we seldom to talk about to put the volunteer and the allowance to put together. But sometimes we still need some auditorium because we have a lot of reasons. So in this 30 minutes, I will share about my small research about the some case or some experience in Asia and some Euro countries. How did they to encourage their volunteers by the auditorium during their training or emergency service. Okay, maybe let me introduce myself. I'm Bruce Wong. As I said, I'm a fellow member of ICPEM, and I'm the emergency rescue volunteer in Hong Kong, almost around 20 years. And so I'm now the deputy unit commander of my emergency service. So surely I'm an emergency volunteer as well. So why I conduct the research is a very I think this my reason is I want to find out some good practice to how to manage our emergency volunteer, how to recruit them, how to encourage them to join the service, and how to encourage them to contribute their time to serve the community. Especially the emergency volunteers is quite different because maybe they will risk their lives to conduct some emergency works. So that I hope it will be it is the good reason to conduct the research. And why I choose the emergency volunteer in the topic, because it's a very important stakeholders in the civil protection, especially in Asia, because actually I'm not familiar in US and Europe, but in Asia we have very intense to recruit many emergency volunteers to do some emergency service, because we can rely on the regular officer, because when there are natural disasters or some disease such like the COVID-19, the civil servant, or I should say the regular officer, are very busy on their different job. So when the disasters came and during the COVID-19, we need a spare manpower, so that emergency volunteer can provide very good service to assist the regular. And I hope we can balance the volunteer principle, because as I said, normally we always talking about is the hope the emergency volunteer can do the unpaid job and some extra, but in fact the volunteers need to eat, need to survive, so that these are all I describe it as a daily needs. So that how to balance it? Should we could provide some allowance for these volunteers? How much should I pay or not pay? Any example in Asia, so that I will share with you about my some research. Because due to many limitations, such as the travel restriction, I cannot travel to other countries to meet the representative for the agency in person. So I just use the email to contact some focal point of other emergency service. So in this research, I focus on the governmental agency. Why I don't choose the NGO? Because normally NGOs they don't have a sufficient fund, so that I think is they intend to not to pay allowance to their volunteers. But in Asia or some countries, governmental agencies will have some funding, so that they can have some allowance to their volunteers. So that I will choose the in Asia, I choose the Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, as well as my hometown Hong Kong. And I also choose one country in Europe, that's Germany, because they have a good volunteer service in Germany, so that there's a national wild service. So that I choose them to have some comparison to see how did they to do these auditorium schemes for their volunteers. Okay, so in my research, I can say that we have I thought that there's 5 types of auditorium for the volunteers, such as in the screen, hourly allowance. These are very common in Hong Kong and the Singapore. And the some allowance for overnight deployment. This is in some countries, and fixed allowance for single operation. It means no matter this how the jurisdiction of the service or training, they only have one single allowance for them. And the accountable allowance as well. It's a quite special allowance. So I will explain it later on. And the annual allowance normally is about the encouragement for the volunteers in their participation or the performance in the year, so that they we can find that is types of the auditorium to encourage the volunteers, and so I will explain it one by one. Okay, first of all is Australia. As you know, Australia is a very big country, so I choose Queensland as an example of the country. So they have 3 types of emergency service, such as a state emergency service, the rural fire service, or our address in short, and the Queensland Fire and Emergency Service. They have regular firefighters and they have auxiliary firefighters as well. So that in these 3 types of volunteers, they have a different auditorium. First of all, is SES. SES is a national wild emergency service in different states. of the Australia, they will have a different command change. Change of command. Some SES under the management by the local fire service. Some SES managed as the independent agency. So no matter they are which the change of command, but their major duties is to provide a multiple emergency assistance including in natural disasters, so that flood rescue, land search and rescue, storm damage recovery service as well. So they will wear the orange uniform to assist their community. In some small village, the SES will also work together with the regular fire service to handle some such as the traffic accident as well. So in this case, they will have an incidental allowance. Is around the US $13 for overnight deployment. It means in daytime they don't have allowance. They only have an allowance for the overnight deployment, because they need to leave their home and then leave their family to contribute to the community, so that the government will give them some allowance to settle it. And then the RFS, their major duties is to handle some countries the wildfires. If you read the news a year ago, Australia have a serious wildfire, so that the volunteers from the RFS to support to handle serious fire with the local fire service. Surely they will also have another duty, is to support the structural fire incident with the local fire service, because they have some fire engines, they have some BA tender to provide some support in serious fire as well. So that they will focusing different from the SES. SES are very focusing on the rescue service, and RFS is focusing on the firefighting. So actually same as the SES, their allowance is the same. They are also the government will also provide the allowance for the overnight deployment for the volunteers. That's the same reason, because they have to leave their family to contribute to the community, so that they will have a fixed allowance to encourage the volunteers as well. And other types of volunteers in Queensland is the auxiliary firefighters. Different from the RFS, they are supporting the frontline regular fire service to handle the structural fire incidents and the traffic accidents, flood rescue, as well as the technical rescue as well. And they also will provide some community education, such as fire prevention seminar or talk to a secondary school or for the community. So they have different types of emergency duties and the regular duties, so that their allowance is quite different. They have an hourly allowance from the US dollars of around $16 to $24 based on their rents. Okay, and they have a annual retention allowance is around 385 US dollars and $542, and actually it also depends on their participation. It means if they are very active in the fire service training or the event, they will have an annual retention allowance. It's based on their participation. So this the calculation is quite different from the compared with the SES and the RFS. And the Germany, they have Germany Federal Agency for Technical Relief, or THW in short. THW volunteers are not only to provide the multiple emergency assistance in the local countries. They also play a very active roles in the international humanitarian assistance, such as the urban search and rescue and the storm damage as well. So, but their allowance is quite different, because they will want the government won't pay the allowance to the volunteers directly. They pay for the volunteers boss, their employers, because for their concepts is if their volunteers, the boss are deployed to handle some emergency situation, that they will cause some loss for their employers, so that they will pay the salaries due to the absence to their employers. So that is quite different, and I think it is also to balance the loss of the employers and the needs of the volunteers. For this is for the local. For the international deployment, they will have another additional daily allowance. It's based on this case by case, because you will calculate the location and jurisdiction as well. These are the method of the Germany. And the Tokyo of Japan, they will have a volunteer fire corps. As you see in the screen, they will assist the firefighters of the regular in the such as firefighting incidents, flood rescue, as well as the public education as well. So they have a fixed allowance for each activity. For example, the firefighting incident operations, or the public education event, they will have a fixed allowance no matter their rank, but they have a annual award for the volunteers. Maybe have some US around $400 to $1,000 based on their rank and their performance. So this also another type of the calculation for different countries for their allowance. And the Hong Kong, we have a free emergency service. If you attend the last crisis hours of the ICPEM, that I also introduced that their works. We have a different agency to deliver different emergency service, such as the auxiliary medical service. They support the emergency ambulance service during the crisis. The civil aid service volunteers, they provide multiple emergency assistance, just like the SCS in Australia. They such as the land search and rescue and compared the vegetation firefighters, and they also have such as the disasters recovery as well. And the GFS, the government fire service auxiliary sessions, they have some medical experts and the air traffic experts to assist the regulars. So unless actually they have different duties, but their calculation is quite similar. They have an hourly allowance from the around US $6 and to the $29 across based on their rents, and the have a ration allowance as well. If their duty for 8 hours or more, and they the government didn't provide the meal, so that they will have again the ration allowance around $13 US dollars for their cover their food and drinks. And there are bounty award as well if they have comply with some requirements to as to an efficiency under the legislation. They will have around $115 US dollars for annually for the bounty award. But only few emergency volunteers they have can gain the bounty award, because this is not easy to achieve, because we have some local legislation to guide the about the occupational safety and health, so that they won't actually they are very hard to achieve the bounty award. And the New Zealand, they have volunteers of fire and emergency of New Zealand. These are quite different, because in New Zealand they have 80% manpower of the agency are the volunteers. Only have 20% are the regular firefighters, so that the volunteers are play a very important roles in the for their community. They are taking the actually they are taking the full-time workload of the agency, so that they will have annual investments around $200 US for cover their pocket expense, and they have a family allowance. This is I think it is quite similar as the Australia case. They will have, if they have overnight training, they will have additional allowance for them. So this is the New Zealand case. And the Singapore, they have a civil defense auxiliary unit. In Singapore, the firefighters are managed by the civil defense force. They have firefighters, the paramedic, and the public education, and the officer. The 3 types of the work also can be work with the auxiliary unit. So that the auxiliary unit volunteers, they also need to work with the regular all together. There were no difference. You go to the fast scene, I go to fast scenes. It's the same case as the New Zealand case. So they will have hourly allowance, such as they have US $3 when they perform FB events, such as the operations or the public events or law enforcers or enforcement activities, and they have incentive awards for their physical tests. If they pass some tests, achieve the standard, they will have an additional award for to encourage them to keep fit for their operation works. So that is also very good for to encourage the volunteers to keep fit in their daily lives. So in these countries, they have some allowance, but they also have some adjustment mechanism to adjust their the allowance. For example, in Australia, actually SCS and RFS in Queensland, they don't have a adjustment mechanism, so that's they didn't adjust their allowance. But for the volunteer firefighters, they will have a review regular to and based on the CPI and the budgets. Germany, they have also they have some assessment, but based on the salary of their volunteer for their daytime work. And the Japan, they also and the Singapore, they also based on the CPI and the budget. But the Singapore, they will also have some judgment. That is that they will adjust the value for food and the public air transportation, because most of Singaporeans also allow the public air transportation to go to their work, and as well as the emergency volunteers work, so that they will also calculate for it. And in New Zealand, they will review every 3 years, and the Hong Kong we will review every 2 years. Based on the different background. Hong Kong will based on the pay of the civil servants and the other factor, and in New Zealand they will also calculate the reversion of the cost as well. So there's an adjustment for the mechanisms. So because it is a very short the sharing, so I try to make it simple, and I would like to share some ideas of in different countries. Actually, there's a no golden rules for all emergency volunteers and in the world, because different countries, they have a different culture. So I cannot say, some ABC country, they have a very good practice, so we should follow them, because different countries, they have a different budget and different culture. So that there are no golden rules for them. But in my mind, as a volunteers, suitable on a sorry, I have some let's say the suitable auditorium is a good way to support our volunteers, especially in crisis, because you can imagine in the COVID-19 in Asia, we deploy many emergency volunteers to assist the isolation center, or they support the regular, because the regular was deployed to handle some crisis. So that if you deploy them in the daytime, they need to work actually. So that you need to feed them. You cannot say, oh, you contribute to the community, I don't need to pay you. We cannot, because they need to survive as well, so that they need to feed the family members, so that if some suitable amount of the allowance is a good way. But because as the Queensland case, we have a different volunteers, but you can see the different volunteers play the different roles in different area, so that we cannot use some money to measure their performance, because you cannot say, oh, some type of works are very dangerous, so we raise their allowance, or some volunteers work is a very low risk, so that I don't pay them. This is not good, because you will create the not fair system in the community, so that it will disencourage the people to join the service, and will damage the image, because if someone will say, oh, why you have a different different situation for different agency. This is, I think, it's not very good to use the money to calculate the value. But for in Hong Kong case, I hope the agency will can avoid the volunteer work become a part-time job in the principle, because I have some experience, just like a few weeks ago, where I have emergency duty for a typhoon. We have a different shift for standby, because you know, typhoon, we don't know when it come and when it go. I don't know, so that's when we handle the to decide different shift. We don't know actually to the actual duration. For the first shift, we have 8 hours, so that we have to have allowance, and we have the ration. But the second shift and the first shift, maybe they don't have 8 hours. So that some volunteers will say, why I don't have some the 8 hours, why I don't have some special allowance, so that they will make the volunteer work become a part-time job. They will very care about the money. So I don't think it's a very good method to put the volunteers work become the part-time job. Surely, in Hong Kong case, we have auxiliary police. They will claim them as a part-time police. It's okay, because they said they claim it is part-time, so that everyone, when they join the service, they will not see them as a volunteer. They will see as a special constable. But another agency, we hope we will avoid it, so that we will prevent some negative impact to the volunteers when join the emergency duties, because if they have very concerned money, then this is no good for their performance. So these are some ideas. So I know somebody's dropped them questions in the Dropbox, so I hope I can reply one by one if we have time. So okay, so okay, let me try to some questions about it, but give me some time, because I need to sorry, because I need time to read the message. So Ken said, do you think the planning and auditorium helps to get away from the ideas that volunteers just compare with the paid professionals? Secondly, does it make it easy to disperse with the service of unsuitable volunteer by stopping the auditorium? I think yes. If we don't pay it, if we stop to the auditorium, maybe some unsuitable volunteers will go away, because oh, no money, then I give away. I think is also have is a good idea, but I don't think is the only way to dismiss with the service of the unsuitable volunteer, because I think if the agency is a professional, they will have some guidelines. There are some performance requirement, training requirement to manage the volunteer, so that stopping the auditorium may be a good method, but I don't think it's the only method on it. And then how to assess the impact of COVID-19 to volunteerism in disaster management? Did we succeed to engage more people in community-based response to the pandemic? Is that encouragement? Yes, because I use the example in Hong Kong. Every day we deploy more than if totally we deploy around 15 volunteers in different agencies to manage the COVID-19 in case. I think is quite busy for the volunteers. So and the demand is quite the workload and demand is quite high, but we must to monitor it, because if you always push the volunteer to do the volunteer work during their daytime, maybe they will distract their daytime and work. Maybe they will impact, have some negative impact. Maybe some boss say, "Oh, don't go to the isolation camp. I don't want to be infected." So some volunteers, maybe they cannot join the isolation camp works during COVID-19, maybe because some boss, they don't know much about the actual work of their employees in the after the office hour. So that is, you can yes, these are some impact of the COVID-19. And some volunteers maybe, oh, I lost my job and I need to focus to find a new job, so that they will their participation will be dropped down. So this is also the challenge of now in nowadays. Building on the ideas whenever paying the volunteers national system, I wonder that is a division between full pay professional and the volunteers is a bit dynamic, because when you put the full pay professional and the volunteers together, then normally you will face a different challenges. So that maybe the idea is you need to let them know why they get to pay. Actually, they are not most of the volunteers are not very concerned about the allowance. Their allowance is just only to cover their daily needs, or maybe they buy a newspaper, or they cover their transportation fees or extra. So that I think is need to have some communication, just like the police service in Hong Kong. They have the auxiliary police, they have regular police. So some maybe if both parties have a very close partnership, then I think easily could be solved. Okay, within the UK, the LRF system, I'm not familiar the UK situation, so I cannot comment on it. Okay, I think I've answered some questions in the chat box. Actually, I think you know that I didn't answer all questions because it's a public area, and the video will upload to the YouTube. So these are some I cannot answer some questions in public, but I think I can drop down my email, and we can have a discussion in the by email, so that we can have some deep discussion. So that's my email, and you can find and you can find me in English as well. So I think it's a very good opportunity to share our some experience in the emergency volunteer management, because I think all of you have a very good experience to manage your volunteers. So I think ICPEM is a very good agency to have put us together and share our experience on it. And I'm looking forward to have a more discussion with the other members. So thank you. This is my I finished my discussion after my presentation.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's always fascinating to hear from you and to hear your perspectives from Hong Kong. And indeed, for those who were not able to hear Bruce's Crisis Hour talk, you can find it on YouTube. So please do go and have a look, and you can learn all about the history of civil defence in Hong Kong. It was a fascinating talk. Some really interesting conversations as well in the chat box. So thank you all for your engagements there. And there will be time, if you are hanging around with us for networking, to have a chat later, though I assume, Bruce, perhaps not, as I think it's currently 1 a.m. where you are. So maybe we can continue the conversation with you tomorrow. But thank you very much for joining us. Okay, next up, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Burchak Erkan and Dr. Yingfang Chan, who have joined to talk to us about some of their research into the 2020 flooding in Turkey. Are you there? Hello.
Yes.
Yep.
Hello. Shall I share my screen, please?
Yes.
Yeah, here you go. Thank you. Thank you for organizing such great conference. I really enjoyed the speakers. Thank you everyone for your participation. This is a joint work with my colleague Wong at Coventry University. Past 3-4 years, my life commutes between Matthew Middle East Technical University and Coventry University. I used to be at Coventry. Now I used to be at Matthew, METU, then to Coventry, then with the pandemic effect back to METU. But I still collaborate with my colleagues in the UK. When I arrived Turkey, I was under lockdown in the UK last year, March to June, and I flew back to Turkey for my annual leave actually at the end of June. And I stayed back. I had to stay back for personal reasons. And in August, when I came back, July passed, and in August, there was a severe flood in Giresun. This is how the name is spelled. Giresun is a province in Black Sea region of Turkey, and the location geographically is always vulnerable to floods. It is forestry and by the sea. So if you ever had a chance to visit Black Sea region of Turkey, that is the geography starting from like above Ankara, Anatolia, up to the border of Georgia. That region is very susceptible and vulnerable to floods. Not earthquakes, but floods and landslides following that. So there was a flood occurred on 22nd of August, and I had a chance to visit the region like few days later with some locals from Giresun. So let me see if my slides go down. That is a joint work with Kong. This is how it looked like. So you see the gentleman looking at the devastating situation. And you can see the traditional lifestyle of Turkey, because people mainly live in apartment blocks, but they, unluckily or luckily, I don't know, I'm by conscious or unconscious, they built the apartment blocks by the riverbed. And so if there is any heavy rain coming through the forest, this water could not reach the Black Sea. So because of the blockage of the people. So we came up with some ideas with Funk, because Funk works with flood risk management, and I said, okay, there occurred a flood. How about we conduct a research and see why things change and how it happens in Giresun. These are the photos. The one on the car buried under the bridge, it was taken by me, and you can see me in my orange boots at the background. This is how it looked like, and it was the first time I have been to a flood affected area rather than an earthquake. So there were 17 casualties and 1,400 plus people were evacuated. Again, there is a forest geographically, then there are little villages, remote and split houses among the fields, agricultural fields, and then there are little districts, and by the sea there is the main province. So this is the geographical lifestyle of the region. And there was damage to bridges, buildings, roads, and agricultural, because 90% of the world's hazelnut production come from the region, as well as some like 60% or more of the world's tea production comes from the region. So there are tea fields and there are hazelnut fields like everywhere. And it is some kind of a tradition that many people, the younger generation, migrated to Istanbul for work purposes. So they live in Istanbul, but they come back during summertime for harvesting their products. This is how it looked like. So this was the main road which connects the Black Sea region to Eastern Anatolia. So this is the only, in that region, in that province, only road to connect two regions, like Black Sea region into Eastern Anatolia. And that road was not approved. It is a joint work consortium by Japanese and Turkish engineers, but the Japanese partners did not approve the construction. However, because of the rush, and I don't know what the other reasons could be, but they opened the road. They opened the road up. So as you can see, the road slapped with the effect of the water, and the minibus of the blue minibus, which was damaged, was swept away with the gendarmerie soldiers in it. So there are lots of casualties in that coming from that minibus. And you can see how the town looked like. Actually, few days, like 2-3 days later, the flood occurred. We were there. So it took a while to remove the debris. This is where the locations exactly on the map. So that city, Giresun, is connected to the Eastern Anatolia, and the road is somewhere here. Okay, the main location where I showed you the pictures is just sits in here, and whole region starting from here. Ankara is here where I am from, and I'm now currently. So from that region to Georgian border, all has the same risk. And also this year, so we didn't conduct any research now, but it is open for research. In Bartın area here, there was a very big devastating flood, if you heard in the news. And that was the biggest one, the most severe one following 1992. Okay, there was a big flood in the same area. So history repeats itself again somehow. And I leave the floor to Fang now. Thank you.
Okay, so I think you can hear me, yeah?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Good
good.
night. I hope everybody.
Okay, so I think you can see, the background of Giresun is kind of, it's pretty high in flood risk. And then actually the idea is when I took students to Turkey to visit their civil protection or emergency service, and I realized actually in Turkey they had pretty good arrangement in terms of risk communication, in terms of public education, in terms of raise awareness, etc. But I started to think about why do they, in Giresun, if they have so frequent flood, possibly every year they would have flood, and then possibly the government started to do something. Why people haven't really done enough actions to prepare for themselves, of this kind of frequent flood. So we started to think about how we can find out the gaps for this sort of risk communication. And we know if we come back to a little bit a theoretical background, we know risk communication actually is a very important part in disaster risk reduction, because we can see that, from, the basic risk communication is about whether or not we can actually give the right message to the right people at the right time. But at the same time, people need to take action. And I think that is kind of holistic framework of risk communication. And then I know there are different models or theories about risk communication, but I think this model that we presented today is kind of holistically capture most of different models. I think in a way, so this is promoted by the Knowledge Center for Disaster Risk Management in European Commission. So they published a book in 2017. So basically the idea is that I think they kind of divide into 4 dimensions. One is, from normative or instrumental or one way or 2 ways. So I think possibly most familiar one would be the risk message approach. That is, we need to disseminate relevant information to the relevant public or stakeholders. And I think a lot of message we receive currently is a long line of this the number 1 diagram. And then if we move on to the second box, actually that is to engage with the public conversation, to allow public to provide some knowledge. So I think possibly like participatory GIS, that is one of the really good example. And then if we move on to the bottom box number 3 here, actually we started to think about, we wanted to have a button-up approach, a 2-way approach to engage with this communication. And I think the good example here in number 3 is insurance actually, and also the early warning information sort of message. So that you need to really take actions to protect yourself. So you wanted to engage with this risk sort of management process, and you can protect yourself. But somehow I think more or less, people wanted to move this trend into box 4. So it's a kind of, button-up approach. You wanted to engage with the conversation, so it's instrumental risk approach. I think here we have a lot of new ways of engagement. I think the help with social media, etc., that is sort of facilitate with this speed. But somehow I think in any case, we wanted to make sure the people who wanted to have more perception, they would take more action. I think that is from past research. So can we move on to the next slides, please? So I think some like jumping. So I think when we look into the risk perception, I think this is also a really nice box to capture the studies of people with the risk perceptions. I know from psychological perspective, researchers started to look into people's perceptions from heuristic sort of perspective, looking into how they can relate to different type of risks, how they can remember different type of risks, so that can enhance their perceptions. But very quickly, people started to realize actually public knowledge, media, the peers or friendship, they will influence on the decision making. And then of course, if we expand it a bit more bigger, that will be social political institutions, so looking into social values. But of course, culture play a very important ground that shape with people's sort of idea and their perceptions. But now I think from theoretical, from academic, it's really nice. We have really good, strong research in risk communication. We have really good research on risk perceptions. But somehow there is a missing gap between communication and perceptions, because we wanted to find out what is missing. Because if we say that we use Jerusalem as an example, if the government has done enough or has done sufficient risk communication, why people hasn't really perceived these risk and why they don't really take actions. That's why we wanted to really explore what is the missing gap, what is the losing bit between this communication and perceptions. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Richard? Yeah. Thank you.
I'll press the page down.
So that's why we started to actually use the idea. So we wanted to explore, the gaps between the risk perception, risk communication, also the behavior change in preparing for flood hazards, especially in Jerusalem area, because we want to see, if the government has done something, if people really participating in the event or they wanted to do something, but why haven't really go home and do something? Or actually from my other experience was that it's always a small group of people who would take event, who would take actions. We wanted to figure out who are the missing elements. So that's where, bring up our objective. So we wanted to really review the flood risk management strategies in Black Sea area, especially, in Jerusalem area. We wanted to investigate the level of risk perception and preparedness of public in this region. And then finally, we are hoping that we can actually provide recommendations to find out, because if we can find the gaps of, the missing elements, maybe we can provide recommendation to AFAD in Turkey so they can have better sort of risk communication. And I think, move on to Bridge. And then we started to think about, we use a questionnaire sort of method to start with the data collection.
Okay, thank you. We conducted a survey, online survey, because of the pandemic conditions, and we tried to reach out to the local people of Giresun. We prepared a set of questionnaires, because I'm a statistician by first degree, but I have been into disaster risk management for 22 years, following my master's thesis onwards. We prepared a set of questions which would reflect the questions and find answers for the questions in the previous slides talked about. So we set the questionnaires, shared it with the community. It was in Turkish, because we talked to the Turkish audience. We shared it with the institutions, with AFAD, Turkish Disaster and Emergency Management Authority, national one, also the provincial directorate. We shared it with municipality. We shared it with the colleagues at Giresun University, local university. So they share with the community, with their relatives, friends. It was a convenient sampling, so we tried to reach out to whoever we could. It reached out to the NGOs who worked in the area, and we received some responses. And this shows, basically, these are like two graphs which shows the age distribution and educational level of the respondents to our survey. So we mainly have the university graduates, educated group of people who responded to the questions, and the distribution of age is like between 40 to 55. The youngest was 24, the youngest participant was 24, and the oldest was age 70. So it's mainly the middle age where we received the information. So these are some brief statistics, descriptive statistics about where they work. So we had respondents from AFAD, Ankara Metropolitan Municipality, Giresun University, General Directorate of Meteorology. This is the agency where the early warning systems messages has been distributed to the community. I received my mobile SMS messages if there's any heavy rain expected, flood expected, or any windstorm or anything expected in Ankara. This system applies everywhere in Turkey, so people receive SMS messages. They receive WhatsApp messages if they belong to any institution about the warnings or the weather. So the average building age in the region was 21. If you realize the first slide where there was an apartment story, so the average size of the floor was 7 and mainly reinforced concrete. So 37 of the participants said they experienced a flood before, and almost 80% of the participants, they didn't have any training related to flood risk, and 60% of the respondents were not aware of the flood risk at the place where they live. There are some more statistics. Insurance, so 78% of the participants said they had no insurance for flood risk. And when I was in the field, I spoke with the shopkeepers, shop owners, like how they would cover their damage, because their shops were really covered under mud and they were in the cleaning process. They said they had no financial coverage at all for their losses. So whatever is done was gone. So that is something sad. And we in the recommendations, it is like there's a system needed to cover the flood risk into the existing maybe Turkish catastrophe insurance pool, which is based mainly on the earthquake risk, but there should be something separate for flood. 58% of the participants said that they receive important information from agencies like AFAD, Meteorological Agency, municipality. They're responsible to send early warning messages. And social media is effective because Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, so the rumor splits very, very, very quickly. People share information, but it needs to be the correct information. And 51%, almost half of the participants were living in Giresun and had an agricultural land, but some of them do not have any risk. Some of them are not aware of if they are under risk or not. But one thing to conclude from my experiences, as Wong suggested, there is information shared, there is early warning system, there are flood maps prepared for the region, hazard maps prepared for the region. I have friends at AFAD who used to work for the Disaster Management Agency of Turkey for 35 years with experience, and they told me like for 30 years they have the flood hazard maps available for the region, and it is regularly updated. But it is mainly the community, the people of the region who do not take it that serious or do not take action. And when I spoke with the people again in the field, actual field, they said the mayor was the relative. So they're all relatives to each other. It's a huge community. It's a small community, but with large size of families. So cousins, cousin of cousin is elected as a mayor. So the mayor, local government decides where to build and approve the building design, etc. So that is the main reason. If one doesn't listen to the rules and regulations and early warning, the others also do not listen. So I don't know how to train or what should be the ways to increase awareness among the community, even with the life losses or the pain they have, the suffering, devastating economically, losing their products, etc. It will repeat again. I'm sure next in the next years we will receive any flood news in Giresun area again. So it needs to be a strong political will. They need to continue with the regular and sustainable early warning messages, strong political will, and consistent at both national and local level. Because if it's at national level and not at local level, with the impact of the community resistance as well, it wouldn't work. Increase community awareness, and the main reason, we need to convince people not to build any construction by the riverbed, because wherever I have seen, like there are several provinces on that coastal area in order. So in every of them, they experience flood every rainy season. But the main reason is they block the riverbed, so the water cannot find a way to reach to the Black Sea region. And also another reason that is a little bit political, but it is truth. It is the truth. They built hydropower thermal plants in the area, so they cut down forestry area. The villagers protested. NGOs joined the protests, but they still continue because of the energy need. And people think that the villagers, the local people think that one of the main reasons to experience such frequent floods is the deforestation in the area. Thank you. Teşekkürler.
Thank you very much, both. Really, really fascinating and a range of interesting issues and recommendations there. Do we have any questions from colleagues, from attendees on the call? Any comments, any thoughts?
I don't see any chat in the chat box.
The pure silence. Well, I think, as I say, that possibly, I think we just finish our survey and then we started to put together with information. We see some gaps in the, especially from risk perception, etc. We would carry out more sort of regression sort of analysis and then looking into what are the missing bit. I can see. Is it Sarah wanted to ask a question, please?
Yes, apologies. I was struggling to find where to raise my hand for a moment.
Okay. I like to see people, so it's great.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you both so much. That was really, really interesting. I was just wondering how much people rely on the government as effectively the insurer of last resort. We see that quite a lot in various different places. So I wondered if that was something that was happening in Turkey.
Okay, people trust the insurance system, especially because everybody talks about the earthquake and because it's the most devastating. If you look at the casualties, the number of the buildings collapsed, so on. So they are very much aware of the earthquake insurance, but flood insurance is not in the agenda yet. But there is crop insurance, a good and strong one. So crop insurance and earthquake insurance works efficiently, not yet.
And does the government step in and provide cash to effectively bail out businesses and farms and things? So there's a reliance on that instead of there's no need to buy insurance then at the moment.
In some occasions, yes, the paternal government approach is still valid in the Turkish society. So after the flood, like the Ministry of Interior, because now AFAD belongs to the Ministry of Interior, it used to be the under Prime Ministry, which made them more powerful at that time. Now they graded down and just connected to one line ministry. So they lost power in that way. They complain, but they have the funding capacity, so they paid all the losses, whatever they could. So why to buy insurance from the community perspective?
Indeed, I guess that's the follow-on question then. What would be the incentive for people?
Okay, if you ask me, they should not pay for some amount, and then the community should understand. So this happened. This issue with the insurance system has been on a long debate for 20 years, maybe, with the start of the Turkish Catastrophe Insurance Pool, TCIP. So an earthquake happened after the start of the TCIP, and again, the politicians went to the field and promised the community that they would pay for all losses. So, but they tried to reduce it down. They stopped it until very recently, perhaps. So the system survives itself. So it will take some time, but we need to train the policymakers first to be able to manage the insurance awareness. If this answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions or comments from colleagues? Okay, fantastic. Thank you both very much for sharing your research with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so to finish today's formal conference sessions, just before we move into a networking session, I'm going to invite back Pete, who's kindly going to talk to us about his research in exploring cultural compatibility between police and fire services. So Pete, I hope you are there. And we've already tested everything, which of course is helpful.
Yeah, can I just do another sound check? Is that okay?
I can hear you, yes. Yeah,
okay, perfect. And see the screen. Okay, well, I'm very conscious, obviously, that I'm following two fantastic presentations, and I'm the person who is standing between us and a glass of something nice. So I'll try and keep it fairly brief. So my initial contribution earlier on in the session, I proposed that the Institute could potentially have a greater role in supporting academics in their research endeavours, and advocated that future conferences might provide an opportunity either in plenary session or perhaps more appropriately in a specialist parallel stream for students to present their ongoing research to a form of initial peer review in that supportive, knowledgeable and conducive environment that the Institute provides. So this second contribution is really an attempt to put that idea into practice and provide delegates with a practical example of what I meant. You already know that I'm engaged on my part-time professional doctorate in emergency services management, and in the broadest sense, my research is looking into cultural compatibility between the police and the fire and rescue service in the UK in the context of governance and the ability of police and crime commissioners to now assume responsibility for their local fire and rescue service, where certain requirements, including that of organisational coterminosity, are met. I'm 2 years into that 4.5-year part-time programme, so I haven't started to collect my data yet. So in terms of managing expectations, I certainly won't be presenting results, discussions or conclusions in this session, but that's really the point, I suppose, in that the idea allows early exposure of developing research in order that it can benefit from the input of others who are either experienced academic supervisors, knowledgeable practitioners, or in many cases, as far as the ICPEM is concerned, both. So to give you some kind of strategic context to the study, if we rewind to the 2015 general election, the Conservative Party's election manifesto then included a pledge to enable fire and police services to work more closely together and develop the role of the elected and accountable Police and Crime Commissioner. In her speech to the Police Federation back in May 2015, the then Home Secretary Theresa May said that in addition to the new policing bill, the new government will make further changes, including enabling the fire and rescue services to engage in much closer joint working with the police. And as part of that fire reform programme in 2016, the government introduced its proposals under 3 main themes, or as any good government consultation requires now, they're called pillars, aren't they? And they were efficiency and collaboration, accountability and transparency, and workforce reform. And as part of the package of proposals under that second pillar of accountability and transparency, the government introduced the Policing and Crime Act of 2017. And that introduced further reforms to policing and, although the title might not suggest it, enabled important changes to the governance of fire and rescue services. Those changes were intended to, and I quote, intend to build capability, improve efficiency, and increase public confidence and further enhance local accountability. And in particular, for the fire and rescue services, it meant that police and crime commissioners could take on responsibility for fire governance where a local case was made. So back in 2015, the Home Secretary launched the government's consultation paper to seek views on the proposals to improve that joint working between the emergency services and enhanced local accountability. And then in January the following year of 2016, the government set out its response to that consultation, including its commitment to bring forward legislation which introduced this high-level duty to collaborate on the 3 emergency services in order to improve efficiency and effectiveness, enabling the PCCs to take on the functions and duties of fire and rescue authorities where the local case is made. Where a PCC does take on the responsibility of the local fire and rescue authority, enabling them to create a single employer for police and fire staff, which would then facilitate the sharing of back office functions and streamlining management. Where they don't choose that model, to enable PCs to be represented on the Fire and Rescue Authority in areas where those FRAs remain in place, and additionally in London to bring in reform such that the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority was abolished and direct responsibility for fire and rescue came under the responsibility of the mayor. So what does that mean in practice? Well, where the governance model is selected as the preferred model for fire and rescue governance, where a police and crime commissioner wants to assume it, the Fire and Rescue Authority and the PCC remain separate, each with their own chief officer, whereas the police and crime commissioner then becomes the police, fire and crime commissioner and assumes the functions of the previous Fire and Rescue Authority. Whereas in the single employer model, it's more it's a more dramatic change, such that there is a single chief officer, so a single employer for both fire and police, but as yet no PCC has chosen the single employer model as their preferred model of governance, where they've wanted to take over governance of fire and rescue. More of that in just a moment. So for those police and crime commissioners who have progressed the assumption of Fire and Rescue Authority duties, of the 36 PCCs in England, 4 produced local business cases. They went out to public consultation and have subsequently taken on fire governance to become a police, fire and crime commissioner. And there, as you see on the slide, are there Essex, Staffordshire, North Yorkshire and Northamptonshire. And those individuals named there were the police and crime commissioners who were in post at the time of producing the local business case, going through that public consultation and assuming responsibility for their local fire and rescue authority. And it comes as no particular surprise that all 4 of those are Conservative PCCs, given that it was indeed the incoming Conservative government who made that manifesto pledge to make the changes. Of those 4, all of them put forward their preferred model of governance, model of fire governance as that governance model, which we've already discussed. So they weren't proposing the single employer model. And as we'll discuss in just a little while, some of the reasons for not going that extra step to maximum collaboration under the single governance model, single employer model, I'm sorry, partly was to do with cultural incompatibility. Of the others, Martin Searle, who was at the time an independent PCC in Gloucestershire, was putting forward a forceful case for assuming governance of the local fire and rescue authority. But that case was put on hold pending the initial PCC elections, which were due to be held, which subsequently became during the lockdown. They were postponed. And in the most recent elections for PCCs in May 2021, Martin Searle lost his seat, and therefore that hasn't gone any further. Whilst in Cambridgeshire and West Mercia, the PCC's applications and local business cases were subject to judicial review. So at the current time, there are 4 PCCs who've taken on governance of fire. Interestingly, if you look at the Northamptonshire PCC's local business case, just as an example, it mentions the word culture 17 times throughout the document and is at times used as a fairly indistinct reason for not moving towards the single employer model. So it mentions culture as a potential barrier to taking on the single employer model, but it doesn't really go into any detail as to what do they mean by that and what impact does that have. And hence that is one of the objectives of my own research, to explore that further and really try to get to the bottom of what that means in the minds of the people who proposed the takeover of governance in the first place. In terms of more general thoughts, I think whenever you watch the news these days, the issue of organisational culture is ubiquitous throughout the news these days. Everything you see when you're talking about organisations, it talks about organisational culture, changes required in organisational culture. And just as an example, in the field of policing, this is a single example and one of many. If we go back into Bishop James' report into the Hillsborough disaster, he quotes Dr. Alan Billings, the PCC in South Yorkshire, who himself highlights the importance of understanding how you achieve cultural change, because to date it has been one of those unfathomable and is often quoted but less understood in terms of, okay, we need some cultural change, but how do we actually go about achieving that in practice? And it's not just policing. You'll see many reports in the context of the Fire and Rescue Service highlighting values, cultures, and the need for culture change in the Fire and Rescue Service. So this is perhaps highlighting the importance of a need to better understand what it is we mean by culture, what we mean by bringing two organisational cultures together, and how they may or may not be compatible in the context of my research. Interestingly, there's actually quite a significant body of literature surrounding that wider process of what's called acculturation, as described really by John Berry, as shown in the diagram on the slide. That's where two separate cultures come together, either voluntarily or reluctantly, and then integrate over time. And they can be in various contexts, such as forced migration, where people of separate cultures come together, or perhaps in the commercial world of mergers and acquisitions, where companies with distinct, separate organisational cultures are brought together, either voluntarily or again in those so-called hostile takeovers. So the range of contexts goes some way to illustrating the value of taking a broader view of the research topic before concentrating on the gap in the literature which any given doctoral study will aim to fill. In other words, the candidate's original contribution to knowledge, which is a requirement of that postgraduate research journey. And with that in mind, I think this is an important kind of visual conception of my own research project. When I first applied to join the doctoral programme at Edge Hill, my view was very much fixed on the specific issue that I wanted to explore in the context of my own organisational requirements. So I was looking very much at that pointed edge, part of the inverted pyramid, that specific application to professional practice. What I was encouraged to do, and I'm sure that this will ring some bells with other researchers on the call tonight, was to take an expanded view, or to zoom out from my specific application to professional practice and take that wider view. So it's what I've called from satellite view to street view. So that top of the pyramid is the satellite view, that broad concepts and theories from the academic literature. So looking at what does culture mean, what is culture in an organisation, how are cultures combined, and then cultural differences between the public and private sectors. That's that kind of wider view. And then starting to focus in on the emergency services, and in my case, the specific context of police and fire governance collaborations. So rather than just immediately focusing in on that inverted point of the pyramid, I suppose, come out from that very specific issue and take it in the context of a wider view, the thing that I call the satellite view. And that introduces issues of itself. Just as an example, there is no single definition of culture. The academic literature reporting on the study of culture and its influence on societies is enormous, with one study suggesting that over 4,600 articles have examined the topic of organisational culture alone since 1980. So the academic literature is huge. And even the very briefest review of that literature reveals, like I suppose, many significant concepts in organisational and social studies. There is no single and commonly applied definition of culture, which itself provides us with a problem and an opportunity. But there are some common assumptions in the definitions that do exist. So in most cases, they are related to history and tradition, both important in the context of police and fire. They have some depth. They're in some ways difficult to grasp and account for, and demand some level of interpretation. They're collective and shared by members of groups and are primarily kind of ideational in character. So they've got to do with values, understandings, beliefs, and other kind of intangible issues. And in general, they're holistic, subjective, and emotional, rather than strictly rational and analytical. So with all that in mind, this is kind of my research aim and objectives. So I'm looking at understanding the role of culture in that joint governance of police and fire and rescue services in England. And under that are some objectives, looking at the organisational cultural influences which exist between police and fire rescue services, understanding the degree to which those cultural factors are determined the preferred model for which PCCs have bid for Fire and Rescue Authority governance, where indeed they have, and understand the process of acculturation in those examples where PCCs have already adopted that governance. And of course, that's important in terms of contemporary policy and professional practice, because it is a continued desire of the current government to see continued integration and collaboration between police and fire. So with that in mind, I just wanted to touch probably on a few of maybe the drier issues of postgraduate research journey, but ones which anyone on the call who's already been through this journey will readily identify. And for those of us who are currently treading the path, these are some of those academically thorny issues which we're grappling with at the moment, and which I mentioned in my first contribution earlier on today. So one of the important things for any postgraduate researcher is to kind of locate their research in terms of their ontology, their epistemology, and their methodology. This itself was kind of a bit tricky for me, and I'm still getting to grips with it. But the fact that we highlight this, I hope, will maybe cause other people who are currently doing their PhDs to nod along in some sort of agreement, in that, how do we get to grips with this, and how do we locate our research and the requirement to provide a justification for where we do locate our research within our ultimate thesis. My own individual path is kind of developed over 20 years or so, but it started out in science and engineering, and on subsequent reflection, I suppose my ontological position in that context clearly aligned with the post-positivism, so dealing with objectivity, apparently value-free observation, testing against hypothesis, and so on. It kind of sought to address the aims of science through description, explanation, prediction, and control, and identify connections between them through cause and effect. And I think it really took a fundamental assumption that reality consists of causal connections between events. And that is very different to my current study of culture, which in this case, it's kind of widely acknowledged that actions are motivated rather than caused. So with individuals acting on the basis of their interpretation of the situation and driven by their motivations for action, which really puts us over towards the interpretivism side of our theoretical perspective as opposed to the positivism side. So that really is a fundamental shift for me. And I've grappled with some of the traditional texts which suggest that you need to be one or the other, and you can't modify your position in the context of the particular study that you're undertaking at the time. So that's an interesting point. In terms of the methodology, it's a mixed method study, but I'm majoring on the qualitative side. So as I've mentioned, rather than trying to understand causal connections, it's attempting to understand reasons that govern human action, which is a different approach and a different methodology, which requires, of course, different methods to authentically capture those experiences, perspectives, interpretations, and motivations. So in order to do that, my current view is, in terms of methods, is semi-structured interviews, which allow the flexibility to explore emerging themes and follow up on developing lines of questioning, as well as questionnaires as a practical solution to the fact that the number of interviews required probably won't be realistic in the time available. So we've got to not only capture our data, but also be realistic in what we can do in the time available to achieve it. So the current work, I'm currently drafting my methodology chapter in advance of my progression viva, which at Edge Hill takes place between the second and the third year of the programme. Continuing with my literature review, which seems to be ever ongoing, and it raises the question about how much is enough. And I'm sure that, again, people currently doing their PhDs and some who have already completed them will be nodding along in recognition of that conundrum, how much is enough. And it reminds me of Professor Alexander's contribution to a previous edition of the Alert Journal, where he talked about it's impossible to keep up with the literature, don't even think about it, trying could damage your health or at least your eyesight, and something that is I'm finding as we go through. The next steps itself will be the interviews and the questionnaires themselves, transcription of those interviews and the coding, the analysis of that raw data, discussion and conclusions. But whilst that is easy to write in 5 simple bullet points, it will of course be a tough journey ahead, and one which I've still got to face. But I think that is one of the benefits of the initial proposal, which I presented earlier on, and which I'm pleased and thankful to see received so much support, about creating that research special interest group to provide a group of people with common interests within the ICPEM, and we can bounce ideas off each other and provide a mutually supportive environment in which to progress our studies. So I'll finish there with some words of wisdom from Einstein. It really has been an interesting journey so far. After 20 years away from academia, I spluttered back into life, and it really does retrain the mind to think, and rather than just regurgitating things, it's kind of looking again and taking things at first principles and training the mind to think again. So that I think is really valuable. So I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions as you see fit.
Thank you very much, Pete. Really interesting, both your overarching overview of your research as well as the subject itself. I find culture fascinating personally, and would be really interested to see what you discover in your research. Mal, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, Pete, I found that really interesting, and I think you've taken on a huge challenge. You know, my background is military, so when I became the EP lead in the Channel Islands, I understood the police service and the fire service better because of the sort of hierarchy and the structure. I've worked with the NHS. I'm still working with the NHS. Just to comment really about, there's a lot of stuff going on in the UK about interoperability, JESIP, and pros and cons of that. I just wonder if the ambulance service was one culture too far to bring into the same pool, because they're the three key sort of emergency services, if you like, at the front line, and then health. And I think health, the NHS has got a completely different culture. So it would be interesting to almost do a compare and contrast why the ambulance service aren't involved in this sort of process because of all the interoperability stuff that's going on in the UK currently.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very valid point. And interestingly, the Home Office is currently promoting greater collaboration, but in terms of governance, at least, between fire and police. And I suppose now that the parent government department responsibility for fire has returned back to the Home Office after our little jaunt around Whitehall for many a year, it's easier for the Home Office to say police and fire because we're both under ultimately Home Office control. But that, I suppose, is at variance with a lot of practical experience where people have suggested that the greater operational compatibility is between fire and ambulance as opposed to fire and police. We saw that during the pandemic with fire services providing operational support to ambulance services under Operation Braidwood. But for the time being, the government's focus for collaboration at the governance level is between police and fire, and that's certainly where my study is focused. I think to introduce the ambulance service into that as well, for me, would be unmanageable.
It would be really useful to see at least an extract of your final work in Alert in the future. That'd be very interesting reading.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thanks, Mal. Yung Fang.
Yes, hello. I think it's a really interesting presentation. I like the way that you wanted to compare with this fire and police. But I just wonder that, because I know the culture is really big sort of issue. I wonder, do you want to break down a little bit of, what element of the culture you want to compare? I don't know if that is your plan.
Well, I think the primary aim, really, given that the onus was on the police and crime commissioners to make the local business case for assuming responsibility for governance of fire, the principal focus is on the views, the experiences, the motivations of the PCCs themselves to develop that that business case and understand what their perceptions of cultural barriers, cultural incompatibility are, such that they didn't want to assume that single employer model that we spoke about. So I'm not so sure that I'm going to go into the interviews with a specific element of organizational culture that needs to be explored, rather to come out with an understanding of what the PCCs themselves saw as the cultural barriers to greater integration.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments for Pete?
I thought it's Sarah Schubert speaking. Hi, Pete. I thought it was really interesting, the comment about kind of the promotion process within the police and fire brigade, and it made me reflect on some of the studies that I'd done in corporate world and how important governance is for the corporate behaviours. So family-owned businesses have much longer term view, and they're much more orientated to organisational resilience, whereas shareholder owned and led organisations are much more driven to that cyclical, what do we need to show in half year, end of year, or my 5-year term as CEO kind of approach. And I wondered whether that might also be an influencing factor.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of that corporate view on it, I think that that's partly what's kind of widened my view to it. Removing myself probably from that point of the inverted pyramid, which was very specific to my organizational context, and taking that broader view of organizational culture, even around things like corporate mergers and acquisitions, where you've got two different organizational cultures coming together, and what that can teach us in terms of how two separate entities come together and merge or not, as the case, or merge successfully or not, as the case may be. So that, I think, is one of my principal learning points so far, is that in that the literature has got a lot more to share with us rather than solely on the specific point that you're looking into, because that should be, by definition, the gap in the knowledge that you want to fill.
Thanks, Pete. Any closing comments or questions for Pete? Fabulous. Thank you very much, Pete. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Okay, and some really interesting chats going on that I'm going to try and not get distracted by as I sum up. A superbly interesting first session. Thank you all so much to our speakers who have taken the time to come and share your insights with us today. And thank you very much to our audience who've attended and engaged with conversations in our chat. We do have another session running tomorrow from 0900 here in the UK, so please do join us if you are able to, and if not, we will record the session and make it available to you for catch up on the Institute's YouTube channel. I'm going to stop the recording in a moment, and we will have the option to hang around and have some networking if anyone would like to. However, as a formal close, just a large thank you from me again to everyone, and we hope to see some of you tomorrow or indeed next year.
Thank you very